Welcome in, everybody. And we have got a very special episode today. I am here with author, musician, voiceover artist, Aaron Ryan. Aaron, welcome.
Welcome. Thanks for having me. That was my elbow, wrist move. I don't
Yeah,
know. Felt like royalty for a minute.
everybody's got something.
That's right.
So, Aaron, first things first, you've got this book out, Dissonance. Uh, Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would be glad to. I am so grateful for creativity, number one. So I actually have done a lot of different creative ventures in my life. Last year, I tried to make a return to music. I've been a musician, as you so astutely observed, and I really wanted to get back into it. But the landscape has entirely changed since it was my kind of heyday in the early '90s, mid '90s. So to get a gig anywhere is inordinately hard. And so I said, finally said sayonara to that. It just was became too much of an expenditure. And I said, I need to create. What am I going to do? And I went, aha, and the light bulb went off. I wrote a sci-fi novel in the early '90s, never completed it, actually deleted it. It just didn't represent where I was going. And I just thought, I would love to get back into authoring again. I've published six or seven business books on voiceover. They've turned out really well, but I wanted to do a fictional account. The story burst out of me, much like an alien queen,
Hmm.
over 3 weeks' time. Actually, right before Thanksgiving. And then it was literally like November 21st through December 16th. Very dystopian, very post-apocalyptic, trying to eke out survival in the shadows after an alien invasion that happened 16 years prior. And it's gritty. It's still in Earth. It's very familiar surroundings and terrain. Just there are now aliens and enemies among us. But the protagonist slowly is discovering that there's more than that. There's a bigger story at play, which makes any good book a better book. So without any spoilers, that's kind of where we're headed. And I'm 181 pages into volume two.
Oh, love that. Yeah, it brought a few things to mind while I was reading through it. Um, it it gave me flashbacks of things like District 9. Um, I don't know if you're an anime fan, but Attack on Titan. Uh, some of the themes are in there. Like, yeah, we have this enemy out in front of us, but we also kind of have to be wary of the ones among our ranks,
Yeah.
right? So thematically, it's a little bit there. It's not uh, this pseudo German story by any means, um, but I could appreciate the and I'm trying not to go into spoilers either, so I'm trying to choose my words real carefully here.
Yeah. You have
Um,
to qualify.
I can recognize some really engaging writing tools in this book, and I know to recognize them. If I was just a layman coming and reading this, I wouldn't. It might clinch me because this feels really familiar, but that's
Yeah.
what it's meant to do, right? So I think that this first volume is going to do exactly as intended. It's going to pull in that sci-fi dystopian audience. It Throw it at Netflix as hard as you can, please, because anytime I can get a sort of Red Dawn feeling
Love it.
story, I mean it's pretty classic at this point.
Yeah, it's proven. Well, I think, and the other thing that's proven is mankind has always been its own Achilles heel. We're just so at war with each other and striving and competing. There's always some, grass is always greener on the other side is just a common trope. And so that creates this striving and this inequity between us. So it's really frustrating, actually. As I was writing it, I'm just going, this is so true today. Even today, we're so polarized politically, culturally. There's not a dystopia in terms of the like the elite and the social class, but there's definitely some stirrings of that. And we're always, anytime you see a poll conducted, it's like right down the line, 50, 51 and 49, 52 and 48, split right down the middle. So what became super apparent to me as I was writing it is the aliens are, of course, deadly. They're terrifying. I was really inspired by A Quiet Place, and there's some. I loved the trailer for that during the Super Bowl yesterday. By the way,
Hmm.
I saw it and went like, "Hey, that's my book," but not quite yet. But I was really inspired by the trailer, and I was inspired by the original movie. They are, of course, so deadly, and you have to watch out for them. The protagonists in my book have to watch out for them. But it just again becomes quickly apparent to the protagonist, Sergeant Cameron Shipley, Jet is his nickname. He's going to be fighting a war on two fronts, and that's the sad part about it. He's not being told specific things. He's a grunt thrown to the wolves, and that's hard to swallow for anybody. Whether you're uh, a salute class flag, what is that called? Flag staff, um, flag officer. Sorry, whether you're a
Yeah, there
flag
you go.
officer or not, it's hard for anybody to swallow. So he gets more and more frustrated. He's a justice seeker and he wants to see justice done. And you'll find that is coming to a conclusion in volume 3, although for now.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that, he's just a regular grunt kind of guy. Whenever I started learning more about Chet, I was like, okay, well, where have I seen this before? It resonated with, say, Starship Troopers, right? We see that grunt perspective all throughout there. I mean, even when they, rank up, they're still kind of, in the trenches.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you're a Warhammer 40K fan.
I actually voiced some characters in Warhammer 4K.
Ah,
I
love
did.
that.
Yep.
But then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I refer to the guardsmen,
Uh-huh.
right? A lot of people's favorite armies is just playing the Imperial Guard
Yeah.
because there's something poetic about just a man going out there with a las gun, which is like a flashlight in this universe. It's
Yeah.
you may as well just be pointing a flashlight,
Yeah.
but
Exactly.
there's trillions of them, and they have this really zealous kind of feel about him, but and they just get finger flicked by demons and things. Uh,
Psychers.
yeah, yeah, psychers are terrifying.
Yes, they are.
Um, so what made you want to come back to Dissonance? I mean, you said you started it in the '90s, you trashed it. What made you pick it back up?
Well, to be clear, so this is not the story that I started in the 90s. The story I started in the 90s was actually called The Omega Room, and it was definitely sci-fi trope. It was, had some rumblings of like enemy of the state, type of thing, type of tone. However, it just didn't quite represent where I wanted to go in terms of a career. It was taking a lot of time. I had a really crappy word processor computer. So it was called the Omega Room. I gave it the Omega and just hit the delete button. And I remember, hitting it and then just sitting there at the computer for about 5 minutes frozen, going, okay, all right, it's gone. I mean, because there was no Control Z really back then. And so this is a different story. I just I am very inspired by sci-fi, particularly Aliens, James Cameron's Aliens, 1986, Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games, Marie Lu's Legend series. I'm currently in the middle of Shade Owen's The Immortal Ones quintilogy, and it's great. Great movie fair and book fair. I love I Am Legend, just the sense of complete overgrown, unmaintained Earth that's just groaning under the pain of nobody taking care of me. There's weeds everywhere. Lions are roaming the street, blah blah blah. You have anarchy. However, with my setting, I wanted to make it dire, really dire, and stack the odds against the protagonist. But if you stack them too high, then it's a book that's really entirely devoid of hope. You have to give them some fighting chance. It's kind of like, if you send him into a ring with a lion, you got to give him a knife of some kind. Otherwise, you're just going to be batting with your fists. But I was very terrified as a child of Medusa, the claymation Medusa the Gorgon in 1981's Clash of the Titans. Terrified. I mean, even to this day, you see that image of her with her bright green eyes, glowing in that high dissonant strain that is played while she's doing her paralysis thing. And I thought, what if there were aliens that had a telepathic or a telekinetic ability to freeze you where you stand psychologically, telekinetically, and then much like the Dilophosaurus in Jurassic Park, spitting its venom on you, you're paralyzed. He can eat you at its leisure, and that's what they do. They are terrifying. They're very fast. They hear like a bat. They don't see too well. Their visual acuity is kind of based on the T-Rex's, ability. So, in some senses, it's a bit of an amalgam. The Gorgons, they're called Gorgons, are a bit of an amalgam, the best and worst of some sci-fi villains. But they do have their own Achilles heel too. Without a spoiler, again, you're going to find that out in the book. I just long answer to a short question. Really wanted to get back to writing something that was compelling, that was moving, and that I felt was a story that needed to be told that would look great on film. So wrote it in kind of a screenplay fashion as well.
Hey, uh, yeah. Again, when I was reading through it, I something that I kept thinking was, God, I hope this gets picked up. Like I don't know if, uh, yeah, of course you do. And hey, if it's given to one of the really hardworking animation studios that either Amazon Prime or Netflix are using nowadays, you could even be a voice director for it. That'd be really
Yeah.
awesome to see. Um,
Yeah, it was terrifying. There were some chapters I wrote that just I had to kill off a character, and it disassembled me. I was a weeping, crying mess. I mean that, and I've never gone there in a story to that extreme. When I went there, it was you kind of do this double take and like put your foot in the water, pull it out, like ooh, do I don't know if I. And when I committed, boy, it tore me apart inside. And so that was just the writing. Then I came back to it in editing. Again, had to revisit it in editing, and it just again, same thing, knocked me out cold. And then recording it in the narration, you'll hear it in the audiobook form, which should be published this week. I'm weeping as I'm narrating because it's just so powerful in those in fleshing out those sections in the creation of the book, that chapter and another. There's a lot of ingenuity into it. There's a lot of suspense. There's a lot of thrill going into it. A lot of like maybe who done it aspect. But my fingers were flying off the keyboard. I mean, I've never seen them. You're looking at them like Bionic Man, uh, and that's just kind of again how the story just burst out. So I would love to see it on the silver screen. Love to see it on Netflix. That would be awesome times a million.
Now, to touch on those characters that you did kill off, um, as both an author and a viewer, part of an audience, how do you feel whenever you do go on the journey with those kinds of characters? They do get killed off, but then some chapters down the line, there's like a callback to that character, a memento, something they wrote, a final initiative or order given to another person or whatever. Um, and does that have to be some big something, or can it be just like a little small memento, right? Like, oh, they placed this hard hitting computer virus in here that's going to wipe it's the weapon that we need to like take out the replicators or
Right.
something like that. Or could it just be like some little mote of inspiration that might give our main character an idea or what have you. And, at the end of the episode, you're like, oh man, I couldn't have done it without good old Jack or whoever.
Right. Yeah, so I think one of the observations that my wife made, and my wife is incredibly insightful and very acute observer of just what's going on around her. She's always present. And one of the things that she said was she loves the grief that you marinate in for this character who's lost. I'd be really careful not to spoil it, but there are several callbacks and things that remind you of that character as you go further through. And it's, this is early in the trilogy where this happens, relatively early. It's chapter 8, I believe, of book 1. It's a character that you haven't been, following too long, so it's easier to dispatch that victim, and as a reader, it's easier to see that victim dispatched and just kind of be able to move on, have some semblance of forward momentum even after that. But yeah, absolutely. They're marinating in their grief for the rest of the story. There are touch points in volume 2 where, things are going to remind you of so and so. And it becomes the catalyst actually for this journey of accountability that Shipley, Cameron Shipley, the protagonist, ends up going on. Again, as I mentioned earlier, he's a justice seeker. This should never have happened. This character should never have been killed off. This was pointless and a throwing away of life. So as they go further into this journey, you'll see that's what's carrying him through. That's what's pushing him through towards this journey of kind of holding people's, calling a spade and holding their feet to the fire. Um, I'm proud of how it turned out, but it just becomes a tone. The other thing is that, in Lord of the Rings, for example, the movie trilogy, I love the books. I read them over and over and over again. But in the movie trilogy, they constantly come back to this little tiny thing as being so malevolent. This tiny little ring is so malevolent, and they have to reestablish that over and over and over again to remind you, because Sauron is disembodied. He's this spirit, this, boogeyman spirit suspended over a tower in Mordor, far away. Um, but they come back and they reestablish. Well, I had to do that because you have chapters of dialogue and chapters of slow journeying towards their objective, where if you don't have a reminder of how vicious and terrifying and again malevolent, I'm chills thinking about it. They are terrifying. They're kind of like a Nazgul meets a Dementor meets a Emperor Palpatine meets a Gorgon. Just you don't want to meet him in a dark alley, and you have to reestablish that to show. And so, in order to do that, you have to take out a character. Um, got to be done.
Right. Now, something that, and I've been a sci-fi fan my whole life. A key foundational point of my fandom, of my enjoyment of anything really, goes beyond science fiction, is I have to have a compelling villain. I
Yeah,
have to have some sort of enthralling bad guy or huge evil force. Like it can be a Palpatine or it could be the Borg, right?
yeah,
You got your Borg queens, but I mean the Borg as a race is coming for you. It's not just the queen.
right.
It could be the replicators from Stargate, right? There's no it, in the original Stargate SG-1, there's no one head replicator. It's just
Right.
a wave of evil metal spiders that aren't even really evil. They're just following uh, their coding.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I mean, we can go on the adventure of the week, A Team MacGyver kind of stories, but what makes it truly enthralling to me is just a damn good villain.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a very good point. The villain that you don't see is scarier than the one that you do. There is oftentimes in like I'll just draw upon Lord of the Rings again. There is this nefarious, corrupting force that is so present and wrapped up in the ring that you're journeying with it. You've got it on your, around your neck. that's the villain, and it's representative of Sauron, who is, obviously the penultimate villain in the trilogy, in that whole story. But I you hit on something a little earlier. They just following the spiders, they're just following their programming. So the Gorgons, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. They've taken out 85% of humanity, in my story. They are, to some extent, drones. Now you've got differing sizes, you've got different behaviors, differing characteristics, but they've all got their job to do. And it really isn't kind of a reasoning, it's just follow your programming type of drone. So what does that connote? When you have drones, you think of bees, and then you think of a hive, and then you think of a queen. So naturally, there's some kind of hierarchy and order that you'll discover as you go up that chain. Um, and I don't got to be careful here too, just kind of tread lightly. You will find, Jet will find rather, and you will find through Jet's eyes, that he is dealing with some of that hierarchy, but it's coming on two fronts, unfortunately for him. And that's the problem. Is Rodney King, way back when in the O.J. Simpson riots, said, "Can we all get along?" We're not getting along. We've had 16 long years to fight these Gorgons and, give them the boot off our planet. And here we are still striving, and there's people working against Jet. And he's just, what is going on here? So there are different things that are working, against him in that story. So there's a villain there. And there are obviously villains in each and every Gorgon floating around out there. They name them Gorgons simply because, not because they have any, representation or similarity to snakes, in their hair, or, ability to eyes and then
Yeah.
freeze into stone, but they do paralyze you. They named them that because of that. And there's tons of those villains floating around. But I think you'll find as you flip through those pages that there's a number of villains, and there is a chapter with a villain, a very right there villain that you'll meet, that is highly representative of how fallen we still are after all this time. I don't want to give it away, but he represents, boy, this is the lowest of depravity that we could sink to, and shouldn't we all be getting along and working together? And we're not.
That's very true. And one last point that I think you highlight really, really well is the importance and just the horrifying nature of the villain that you do not see. Uh, I and a whole bunch of people consider uh, the story of Avatar: The Last Airbender to be a really, really good piece
Mhm.
of literature in media. And the main villain, Ozai, you don't see him hardly
Ever.
at all.
Yeah.
Your first instances of him, he's this veiled, shadowed figure, but his presence is felt through every episode, with all of the main cast of characters, not just Zuko or his brother Iroh.
Right.
And of course, being voiced by Mark Hamill doesn't really hurt. um, but and when you finally do meet him, he is terrifying,
Yes.
right? What he just kind of coldly does to his son, and his awesome powers that he
Right.
has whenever he's just burning the entire world. Um, so it's that monster movie payoff, right? What makes the monster terrifying is you see his shadow, you never see him.
Right.
You feel the impending danger that comes with the wave of cold and emptiness that you get just by the monster's presence. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really one of the tropes that I said kind of caught me, right? Is, oh, this is familiar. What is this?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
you talk about, that's the mist. The Gorgons have a mist that encircles them and envelops them. If you flip that script for a minute, however, look at the movie Batman, 1989 Batman with Michael Keaton. It's about Batman, but you barely ever see him. It's all about the Joker.
Hmm.
right? So Batman's presence is felt as a force for good throughout the movie. Of course, he's struggling and he's got his own share of traumas that he's dealing with. But it's kind of one of those things I remember going like, "Where's Batman?" While watching that movie. So it's the same but opposite, obviously. But yeah, and I mean a malevolent force that's kind of uncontainable. I loved, much as the movie is panned, I loved X-Men 3, at least for the portrayal of the Phoenix. I love Jean Grey's portrayal of the Phoenix. Famke Janssen's
Hmm.
portrayal of the Phoenix. Loved that. I mean, just effectually, story-wise, how absolutely unrestrainable she was. And that's a presence that's felt and seen, so you can grapple with it a bit better. But anytime you're in the shadows, anytime there's something that's felt and you can't put your finger on it and touch it, it's like, how do you contend with something like that? It sends the hairs on your arms standing up.
Yeah, and it's kind of translatable to um, how you mentioned that we're really not working together in real life today, because that is what the uncontainable uh, villain of our real life modern world kind of is to me. Is we're not working together. We have so much uh, we have so much division, and I kind of try to see how we can get to that Star Trek level of uh, not just technology, but being able to coalesce and work together and have a something resembling a resounding peace,
Right.
right? A whole bunch of people are rightly so very afraid of something called a one world government.
Yeah.
Um, but if you think about it, unless you want just unending war in space amongst humans, it's almost what we need.
It's almost inevitable. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just coalescing of everything. Why don't we all come under one banner? And in a sense, there's unity there. However, there's a lot of things and a lot of logistics and entanglements that would need to be ironed out. It's kind of like when, again, just we're referencing a lot of movies here, but Star Trek Six: The Undiscovered Country, when the Klingon planet blew up, and they had to they had to come to the Klingons' aid, and no one wanted to do that. uh, Kirk and Spock and the team are sent out, and of course, then you have a murder, and then there's a whodunit, and they go on this journey to figure out. He says at the end, people can be very opposed to change. So yeah, it's just how do we all get along? I think is the story that resonates with both of us the most.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in almost any sci-fi franchise that has humans sent out into space coming from Earth, um, with a very, very special exception of Firefly, uh,
Yes.
the world governments do have to kind of boil down and iron together
Mhm.
to coalesce and send out space colonies. And Firefly is very special because the explanation for how people got out into it, the Earth got used up, and that's it. It
Yeah.
like
That's like
what? That's
Wally. Happened in Wally.
yeah. It was so fun, just such a dang fun show.
Yeah.
So with science fiction being such a vast genre, it kind of it encompasses a whole bunch of things that feel like they can stand on their own and be their own subcategory. Do you think that the genre of science fiction kind of needs some redefining, so we could set up some boundaries maybe to say, all right, everything inside of here is strictly science fiction, everything outside of it is sci-fi adjacent.
That's a really good question. I've not thought that far into it. I mean, ultimately, when you start walling that garden, then you're going to have a lot of people resistant to that and just saying, this definitely belongs in that category. It's, just on a simple level. Right now, I'm dealing with marketing the book, and of course, there's so many categories on Amazon for books. And then, you got this many, and then you go into the young adult category, teen and young adult, and then you go into the sci-fi category, and then the dystopian and the post-apocalyptic and the aliens. It just contracts. And in some senses that's good, but it's also bad. It would just be nice to have an overall category where this deals with pretend happenings within the realm of science fiction. Here we go. And I don't think that I don't think I'm not one that's in favor of like restricting or redefining, but I will say that there are a lot of things that fall within that category that probably aren't quite there. Like steampunk kind of stuff
Hmm.
doesn't ever really strike me as science fiction. Historical fiction going back, if that's ever categorized under science fiction, it's granted it's maybe they time traveled, you know, and so they went back to Marty McFly went back to the 50s, whatever. There's nothing really, well, that's a poor example because they have the DeLorean and all that stuff. But if there's some kind of whatever, they're going back to reinvent history and they're dealing with a lot of like steampunk stuff. It's not that doesn't really strike me as science fiction. It should be in its own kind of like steampunk category, and here's science fiction over here. It's still fiction, but it's not like science fiction. In all fairness, I think looking at my own books, I don't really look at them necessarily as science fiction. Science fiction has always tended to suggest, I think, to a lot of people, Star Trek, the glossiness, the antiseptic nature, the clean nature of space. Everything's shiny in the future. Then you have the other side of it, that's Star Wars. It's gritty. There's oil leaking out of the panels on the side of the ship. They're dirty. Everything needs to be cleaned and washed, and just got to send Martha Stewart in there. And and then you've got things in between. Well, or they're in space or they're on Earth. So my book is set in a very much modern Earth that's in a sort of arrested development, because here we are in 2024. The book is set in 2026. There's a limited amount of progress we will have had between now and then, so therefore it's attainable. It becomes even more attainable when you factor in the fact that we have been invaded by an alien species in 2026. Here we are in 2042, but we're in hiding. 85% of humanity has died off, has been killed off. So there hasn't been a lot of progress or forward momentum. It's still very attainable. How does that fall under science fiction then? It's not clean and glossy in the future. It's dirty, but it's still on Earth. So how does that fall? But it does. It's fiction and it's science based and there's aliens and all that stuff. So it's hard. It's a hard category to corral.
Yeah, I definitely think that it is. Um, but it's just gotten so dang massive, and it's done so over the course of 120 years, give or take.
How
It
long
uh,
sci-fi's been around?
oh well, as far as we would think of say modern science fiction.
Mm.
It really started up in the late 1800s.
H.G. Wells and Time Machine and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
Invisible
yeah, yeah,
Man.
yeah. And then well, that also kind of adds into the question of how do you define what science fiction is, right?
Yeah,
Do you start back with people like Wells? Do you go a little bit further down the line? Do you start with Mary Shelley,
yeah,
Frankenstein?
yeah.
So where is that starting point really? Because the question is not so much to be exclusatory to certain stories. It's to really find out, okay, we have this set definition. Where did that start? Where
Right.
where where can we find an anchor point to say, all right, this is where the history begins?
Yeah. Good, fair question. I think Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun,
Oh,
and there's a season for everything, but there's nothing new under the sun. So everything kind of hails from something that a predecessor that came before. That was redundant. Everything hails from a predecessor. Um,
it's the Canterbury effect, right? The
yeah,
Canterbury Tales.
exactly. And we saw that. That was such a or that we saw the Canterbury Ghost rather. But I I think that everything pays homage to the things that came before to a certain respect, a certain extent, and I don't think that's unkind or unfair to reinvent. What I love about, for example, the Hunger Games, and I saw the movies before I actually read the books, is it's so depressing. Granted, this isn't Earth, it's Panem, it's somewhere else,
Sure.
but it's depressing, it's sad, and like, oh, this is so horrible. What a horrible environment to grow up in. But again, they have hope. You can't purge a story of hope, otherwise you lose readers. And
Right.
we're all about the readers, but and I'm reading a new series right now. I think I mentioned it earlier. Shade Owen's The Immortal Ones. It's a quintilogy, very reminiscent of the Hunger Games when you first started out.
Hmm.
You have to have hope, but all of those stories that are way back when, I mean, going back to Ray Bradbury, even in much more modern times with the War of the Worlds, there was a sliver of hope. We just couldn't see it. And we didn't even have to do anything. We could have just stayed hidden, and the parasites and the bacteria would have eventually killed them off, had we just hidden. Um, yeah, you probably would have, been a little loss of life, but still, all of the stuff that comes after pays homage to the things that came before. And I think it's just a fitting tribute that you have so many different styles of science fiction today. It's good to reinvent that wheel. It's because then you step in that new world and you go, wow, this is new.
Right.
This is different. I like this. What is this? If it's so familiar, you kind of lose the creative edge. Or sorry, you lose the familiarity. Um, it's just anyway, got to stretch yourself when you write.
Sounds painful. But
Yeah, it's not the draw and quarter stretching, not that kind, not the William Wallace
okay.
stretch. Just
Well,
a little bit of like flexibility.
sure. As
Go
long as we're
places,
safe.
right? Go places where you didn't think you could go.
I know you're a voice actor. What are some of the things that you voiced for?
Well, there's a great new book out called Dissonance Volume One Reality, and boy, the voiceover narrator for that book is phenomenal. I mean,
I
just
I
oh,
bet.
wonderful. He's top of the line, really. I'm Fortune 500 companies all over the world, very privileged and proud to be right now the voice of United Healthcare. There was a lot of work that came for that for open enrollment that happened, I think, starting in September, October, whatever, November. So I did a lot of work for that, and some of those commercials are still swirling around out there somewhere. But I've done Microsoft, Amazon, Uber, Cadillac, Wrangler, Nutrisystem, um, BMW, Enterprise, whole slew of e-learning companies, Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. I've done a ton of work for a lot of companies, and it's probably good that I don't remember all of them anymore. There was a time where I could remember all of them, but it's great. I do a lot of commercial and e-learning narration. So audiobooks are not my forte intentionally. They don't pay very well to narrate, and they take a long time to do so. So they wreak havoc on your voice. You have to commit to doing just that for a while, and I prefer commercial and e-learning.
Okay. Why- Quite quite a resume,
Yeah,
and to
I'm
say
very
the
grateful.
least.
I love it. Yeah.
Good Lord. That's what I hear from any voice talent that talks about doing the work is I I don't think I've heard a bad word about it. Um, I mean, people working with different people that's going to vary, but the work itself, I don't think I've heard a mal word against it.
Well, not everyone gets a studio mascot either. So you can't really see her there, but that is Macy Girl, who's laying right there on the chair in the studio. So she's rather, I don't know that I just have to shine a big floodlight in there, but she is a lab hound pointer. She's 12 years old, and she's my favorite baby girl. She's a good girl. She's very comfortable right now, so she won't be joining us.
I can see the chair and it's just pitch black in in
It
the
is such
seat. So I was like, is that
It might be a gorgon.
Spider? Is it an iguana? What is that?
No
That that
spiders, no iguanas.
that reminds me of a joke I saw on Kill Tony. The comedian said, I have a chameleon infestation, but it's really hard to tell.
I get it. Yeah, they're blended in. Nice.
It's fun. So just really quick, what are in this is just jumping straight into nerddom, but what are some of your favorite realms that you enjoy visiting?
Well, I'm a massive Lord of the Rings geek. Aliens. If I could swivel this camera here, I've got a huge bookshelf that's just loaded with Lord of the Rings collectibles. And last May, I turned 50, so getting old. But when I did that, I took a solo trip out to uh, Dalton, Georgia. And they basically have an Airbnb there that is Lord of the Rings themed, and I was in heaven. It was absolutely, it's called Rohan. I think he's changed the name now, but it was called Rohan at the time, and it was Rohan. You are in Meduseld, in the chief palace there on top of the hill in Meduseld. And geez, collectibles galore. It was so cool. Of course, it's a mashup of all the parts of Lord of the Rings around every corner. So, there's a little bit of Fellowship here, a little bit of Return of the King, Two Towers. Just it's interspersed everywhere, and it's absolutely amazing. Love Lord of the Rings. However, as much of a Rings geek as I am, and I always will be, and I evermore shall be, Aliens is my top favorite movie of all time. 1986 Aliens with James Cameron. I love that movie so much for everything that it represents in terms of cinematic value, quality filmmaking, excellent storytelling, terrifying creatures, characters that you love, wonderful plot, great effects, score, the musical score, everything about it is so good. Um, I love that. Big fan of the Terminator series. I'm a total Transformers original G1, but all the G1s are coming back with way more articulatable forms, and so there's a ton of Transformers over there. Skyfire is my favorite out of all the Transformers, and Grimlock, the Dinobot. I love the Zorro films. I love those. Antonio Banderas. I love the um, what else? There's so many. I mean, I could go on and on about the different movies. The TV shows right now, I'm in Smallville. I've never watched Smallville, and I'm absolutely loving going through Smallville. I'm in season 3. He's just come out of the red kryptonite haze, so that's good. Books, again, Lord of the Rings at the very top, and then a distant second, third, fourth, and fifth. Anything like dystopian, I love Suzanne Collins, Marie Lu, Shade Owens, K.A. Riley. I'm looking forward to that. James S.A. Corey with The Expanse. So, yeah, a big fan of Superman. How come I didn't mention that? I've got some Superman stuff here. And Star Wars, of course. Yeah, I'm not as much of a fan of the things that Disney is churning out as much. I'm an original release fanatic, and the things that come afterwards that are supplemental are kind of like eh. So like Lord of the Rings, yeah, Rings of Power, eh. Star Wars G1 stuff, episode 4, 5, and 6, and then episode 1, 2, and 3, eh, and 7, 8, and 9. Eh. So anyway. Star Trek, love Star Trek, the original movies.
Okay, so you're throwing out a lot
Yeah.
that uh, kind of makes me go into a branch of a previous question, kind of defining what certain things are and subsequently what they are not. So, Lord of the Rings, let's say, when I saw Rings of Power, I was like, what? There are beardless dwarves. Why are there beard? What? that makes that makes no sense. Um, and what they did with Sauron and Galadriel, not only is it not uh, written canon. It's completely its own
Artistic
shtick.
license. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you want to do that, fine. But if it's gonna be if it's something this big, give us that caveat. Uh, Conversely, if you do it with something like The Boys, The Boys it was a beloved graphic novel series, right?
Yeah.
So it had a pretty big fan base, pretty big audience. A bunch of my buddies were like, "This is getting a show. This is amazing." Now, the show itself is very different from the series, from the graphic novel series. And if you read the graphic novels, thankfully so, because there's
Right.
just a whole bunch that I think would get Amazon uh, Prime HQ kind of burned to the ground
Right.
um, if they put it on a like actually on screen. But the the vastness of uh, the chasm that is in between how big and how influential and important and earth shattering the boys is versus Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is colossal.
It's
It's
up.
magnanimous. It's at the top.
Yeah.
The boys, you can play around with that all you want. It's fine. There's an enormous difference there. We
Yeah.
didn't need that caveat with the boys. We don't need it with Invincible. That's also a name sometime. I'm
Right.
just plugging away, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
There's tons.
yeah, and we need that caveat with something as big as Lord of the Rings. I
Yeah.
think um, to kind of just warn us that it's going to be crazily different.
Hmm.
Um, and you mentioned that you are a bit of a uh, Star Wars purist. My buddies would call themselves Star Wars purists.
Hmm.
Um, I'm an old EU geek, so the 150 plus novels and books and things that came out, I read them all, baby.
Yeah.
Like,
Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
did. What was the book that had the Eye of Palpatine, that big old asteroid proto Death Star thing?
I don't remember.
Um, there's one of my favorites, which is vastly disliked by the EU community, is the courtship of Princess Leia,
Mm.
where the now New Republic is considering using Leia as a political piece to marry her off to the Prince of the Hapes Cluster, who's this smoking hottie.
Yeah.
He's got a fleet of battle dragon starships. He's got a mountain of treasure that the newly formed government could really use. So
Yeah.
they're like, "Hey, Leia, can you?" Han's like, "Nope."
Nope.
Kidnaps her and takes her on this
Job
adventure
on
across
it.
the galaxy.
Good job.
So there's this wealth of, and that's why I make that distinction between just how big something like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars is versus the boys. Star Wars has this mountain, this treasure trove of stories and ideas and comics and graphic novels and everything else that's behind it
Right.
that was just all kind of chunked with the Disney acquisition. And to kind of rub salt into the wound, you had Disney Lucasfilm reps like Kathleen Kennedy come out and say, well, we just don't have, you know, anything to go off of story wise. So we're kind of making it up as we go along. And then you have us and probably the purists too
Tons.
screaming in the background, going, what are you talking about?
Right.
You could have had, we could have had all of these different. I digress. Otherwise, it'll be a diatribe of it. We'll put them on trial here.
Right.
But as well, you might be a great person to ask this question to, um, because you are an author and you've got all of these experiences. Um, and you're a author of a novel here, a book rather than a script. Although you did mention earlier that you kind of wrote it in such a way that it could be pretty easily converted into a script.
You have to visualize it as you're going along.
Right. Um, how much poking and prodding can be done to a story? How much artistic license can be taken before it becomes not the story that was originally written? Because there are going to be things that need to be adjusted to be put onto a television screen. Sure.
Of course.
But how much of that can be done before it's considered butchered?
Well, the more you add, the more you start stuffing holes with things that you think go in there. It's putting squares in round holes and all of that stuff. The instant example that comes to mind is just putting unnecessary garbage into a film or a book that doesn't belong, i.e., George Lucas and the he's replete with all of these new additions that he's released, and there's this correction and that correction, and geez, the sheer amount of iterations that Obi-Wan Kenobi's yell has gone through when he encounters Luke after uh, the Sand People attack. It's turned into this orgasmic scream, and they're like, what was wrong with the first one? It was so silly and so needless. And the same can be true when you do that to a story. You end up kind of warping the original vision and clouding it. And you're going to have reviews from people that say this is slow paced. There's too many threads going out in different directions. And as an author, you run the risk of not solving all of those threads. You can't have too many different things. And I think that's where an author like Tolkien with Lord of the Rings is so bulletproof in that he decided to split in the Two Towers, the end of Fellowship of the Ring. He decided to split into three different storylines, running narratives, and slice them all together. Granted, the first half of Two Towers is Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas chasing after just Merry and Pippin. And then book four, which is Two Towers Part Two, is then it's Frodo and Sam and their journey to Mordor. So, but it's three different running lines, and you've got to then establish a chronology. Okay, they're here when they're here, and if that's taken a week, then they would be over here, and you have to maintain this, this running storyline of all these things that have to happen in tandem. And thus the appendices, and the massive amount of appendices. But I'm nowhere near Tolkien. He was absolutely brilliant, and I will always pale in comparison to him. Every author will. I think the dude invented an entire language and then just wrote a book around it. That sounds a little cavalier. I don't mean it like that. He wrote a massive epic around this thing. So you have to be really careful, and you have a responsibility to your readers and your viewers that you're giving them something that they'll actually care about and not convoluting it with all this extra detail.
Right. And I think maybe somebody said this about him, or it's a quote from Tolkien, but whenever he did invent the Elvish language, he said, "Well, I made this language. Now I have to write a story around it."
Right.
uh, it just shows how kind of a badass he was.
Yeah.
Um, but I what do in this will be the last really big question. Kind of going off of that last one, do you think that studios and writers and executives and producers are not really trusting their audience to be intelligent enough to process a very complicated story? Because we've seen how like kind of piecemeal and bland and uh, just uneventful or unfulfilling a lot of these stories that we've been getting the past 10, 15 years have been.
hmm So There are different things in volume two that I'm currently writing right now, or scribing, as it were, that are callbacks to details that you've come to learn in volume one. And I think that you have to do that in order to carry it forward, because otherwise this is not pointless, but it becomes then minutia. If it's just a happenstance thing that just happened and then it's done with, well, whatever. But if it sounded ominous, compelling, important enough in, the first occurrence, then you need to revisit that in your storyline later on. I don't think that's complicating the story. I don't think a revisitation then assumes that your audience won't remember. I think that honestly, though, most of them won't. You've given them a lot of material to digest in a story. But then again, just not to harp too much on George Lucas, but I will.
Yeah.
In the extended versions or the recreation abominations of the Star Wars trilogy, uh, you have that scene where it was originally a man Jabba that Han Solo walks around and goes, Jabba, you're a wonderful human being. It was a man. Then it was changed into the slug, a CGI slug, and they have him walk over him, and then it looks shoddy and horrible. And then they walk off, they slither off and walk off together. And then you see this guy walk in, and then he turns towards the camera, and it's Boba Fett, you know, and it's just like you could have just had him walk. He didn't need to turn towards the camera and go, "Oh, we're that dumb that we need to
Hmm.
see a frontal profile of, I mean, a frontal view in order to recognize that it's Boba Fett." No, a profile is totally good. We can see his rocket pack, we can see his helmet, we can see him carrying his gun, we can tell the color of the armor. It's just they're dead giveaways, and that to me is more of a patronization or a condescension of your audience that you have to just, hey, make I have to make sure you see this now. Did you see it? Look, did you see this? This right
Hmm.
here. It's just kind of silly. And that's why they're so widely panned, those new improvements in the trilogy. So I think that, yeah, you could definitely go overboard. But I think that if a person, this is why you have to make a book so compelling and gripping for them to continue reading. If you've carried them and sustained their interest all this time, then they'll remember when you're alluding back to something earlier. If it was even a minutia detail, they're probably going to remember that because they want to read and their appetite is voracious to read through it. They'll remember.
Well, there you have it, folks. Straight from the author himself, Aaron Ryan. Be sure to keep all of that in mind when you're reading through Dissonance. Aaron,
Bald reality.
Aaron, thank you so much for
Yeah,
hopping on the show today.
absolutely.
You can come back whenever you write another book, do an audio. Hell, if you do a Qualtrics e-learning, yeah, come back on and we'll talk about it.
I will. Until then, everyone should go to dissonancetheseries.com and then you can actually enlist. I call it enlisting because it's military, and our protagonist is military. You can sign up at the blog there and then be kept up to date on further releases, what's going on with the storyline, different promos, sales of the book that are running, KDP, Kindle, everywhere else. Sign up on that blog and then you'll find out what's going on in the world of Clarkston, Tennessee, Earth in the year 2042. It's going to be almost 2043 by the time we reach the end of the trilogy. So you act now. Better hurry.
Well, Aaron, after reading through it, let's hope you're not a prophet. But
That's right.
but for now, my friend, live long and prosper, and may the force be with us all.
Nanu, nanu.